It's my tremendous pleasure to introduce John McNeill. He's one of those scholars who is very difficult to introduce because if I was to read off all of his accomplishments, we wouldn't have time for a talk. But very briefly, he's a professor at Georgetown University, where he has taught and researched world history, environmental history, and international history since 1985. Among his many awards and fellowships are 2 Fulbrights, fellowships from the Guggenheim, MacArthur, so I guess a Genius Award, Woodrow Wilson Center, visiting positions at Oslo, Canterbury, and Otago, as well as the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales. Also an elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, awarded the Toynbee Prize for academic and public contributions to humanity, has served as the president of the American Society for Environmental History, as well as the president for the American History Association, and his books exploring global, Caribbean, and Mediterranean environmental history have been translated into 13 languages. And today he will be speaking to us about the ingredients of industrialization, ecological teleconnections in 19th century world environmental history. So thank you very much, John, for joining us at what I know is a late hour in Washington, D.C.
Right. So I hope you can all hear me properly. And thank you very much, Miles, for those kind words. I do need to correct you on one thing. Unfortunately, that MacArthur Fellowship was just a run-of-the-mill research fellowship, not the Genius Award. So you're overestimating me. Yeah, it is evening here, but I want to say good morning to everyone in Singapore. It's a great pity that I can't be with you in person, but this, I guess, is the next best thing. I will be speaking, as Miles said, about what I'm calling ingredients of industrialization. This is my next scholarly book project, which I envision will take me a few years. And here is what I'm going to go through with you this morning. First, I'll show you what my general plan of this book is. I always plan a book out in advance before I get far into the research. I'll explain what my aims and inspirations are in this project. I'll explain the concept of ecological teleconnections, which is at the core of this project. I'll give you a few examples. And then I'm going to explore some of the problems that I'm having with this project. I'm going to, in effect, invite you into my kitchen as a scholar and admit that there's some unresolved issues that I'm still wrestling with. And in fact, I'll be grateful if you have any useful suggestions for me. I'll be sure to take notes. So in a way, I'm crowdsourcing my next book by seeking your assistance and inviting you into my kitchen. So here's the general plan of the project as I now envision it. It's a 19th century global environmental history, but it has industrialization at the center of it. So it's not a general global environmental history. It's a thematic one privileging industrialization. And I see this in 2 main parts. The first part is, I would say, rather conventional, and I'm not going to say much of anything about it this morning. And in fact, it's not all that interesting to me. A lot of environmental historians have already explored the ecological effects of industrialization in industrial heartlands, whether that's in Britain or Germany or the United States or to some extent also in Japan. And I don't have anything new and different to say about that. What I think I have to say that's new and different is in part two, respects in which the four corners of the earth were involved in industrialization and disrupted ecologically by industrialization. And then there might be a part three to this book, because in recent decades, East and Southeast Asia have undergone, as everyone in Singapore well knows, a tremendously rapid industrialization with its own history of resource demands and ecological disruption around the world. So I might include that. Usually editors at publishing houses want books that come up to the present. They think they're going to sell more, and so they'll want me to do it that way. I'm not sure if it's advisable. It might detract from the central message that I'm trying to get across. I haven't made up my mind about that. So here, as I understand it, are my two main ambitions in this project. I may have other ambitions, subconscious ones, but I don't know what they are, so we'll leave those aside. Here are the ones that I'm aware of. First, I want to recast the Industrial Revolution and ecologize it. Ecologize is not a word in English, but it should be a word. I want to present it to historians and to the general public as a fundamental ecological transformation on the global scale, not just an economic and social transformation in the lands of industrialization themselves. It was that, but it was more than that at the same time. Equally, I want to globalize the Industrial Revolution and show how deeply involved every continent except Antarctica, was involved from very early on in the history of industrialization. And that, I think, is underappreciated by historians, economists, and everybody else who pays any attention to the 19th century industrialization experience. So those are my aims. The reason I'm doing this, excuse me, is mainly because of two moments of inspiration several years ago now. And the first of these came when I was reading an old book from the 19th century, once upon a time, a famous book, The Coal Question by William Jevons. And in that book, I came across this passage, which I have written out for you here, about how it is coal that allows Britain to import the grain, the timber, the wool, silver, gold, tea, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. At the same time, I came across this map. This is the work of a French engineer, Charles Minard. You may have seen his really famous map of Napoleon's army going into Russia in 1812 and coming out of Russia, and it gets narrower with each moment of time. It's one of the great infographics of all time. Well, that's Charles Minard. This is his infographic of the exports of coal from Britain in 1864. Before I saw this, I had no idea about the scale of British coal exports. Looks like Singapore barely shows up in this map. At any rate, Jevons' passage was one inspiration for me. A second was reading one sentence in this book, The Destruction of the Bison by Andrew Eisenberg. I thought I knew about the destruction of the North American bison. I thought it was connected mainly to the efforts of the US Army to destroy the food supply of what we call the Plains Indians in the United States. But according to Eisenberg, that was a secondary or tertiary factor. The most important factor was that bison leather made the best belting for textile mills. And that leather was used in the textile mills of Eastern North America, and to some extent it was used in textile mills in Britain. And that's the main reason why a population of 20 to 40 million bison in 1840 was reduced to about 1,000 by 1881. This was shocking to me to learn this. And I thought, what else went into industrialization that had dramatic environmental effects? And the bison are important because bison are so-called keystone species. They regulate the ecology, or I should put this in the past tense, they regulated the ecology of the high plains in North America. And if you extract them from the equation, lots of other things change in terms of vegetation and animal populations. So I started hunting for other examples of things like that. And I found several, and you're going to hear about them this morning, or about some of them. So here's all I'm going to say about part one of the book. And I'm saying this only because of my belief that you should never pass up a chance to quote Charles Dickens when you have one. So Dickens has one of the great descriptions of London air quality as of about 1850 in Bleak House. And so, yes, air pollution in British cities was one of the dramatic ecological consequences of industrialization. But of course, we already knew that. I have nothing new to say about it that first Dickens and then lots of historians haven't already said. And on top of that, there are no teleconnections involved in that. And the teleconnections are what really interest me. So what are teleconnections? So what I mean by that is linkages over hundreds, usually thousands, sometimes several thousands of kilometers between the zones of industrialization and zones that produced what I call ingredients of industrialization. And that means fibers like cotton and wool. It means ores like lead and copper. It means lubricants like whale oil and palm oil. It means dyestuffs. It means all sorts of things that went into industrial processes, ingredients. I could call them raw materials or commodities, but I prefer ingredients. I don't want to use the language of economists here. I want to use my own language and liberate these things from the connotations of economics. So at the heart of teleconnections was cheap energy, coal in the main, but also to some extent water power, at least up until 1850 or so. So cheap energy in factories that made the use of these ingredients more and more practical. Cheap energy in transport that made it feasible to move wool from Australia to Britain in a way that was sufficiently economic. So these teleconnections are not actually new, or most of them are not new in the 19th century, but they grow tremendously in the 19th century, mainly because of cheap energy, making them more and more practical, mobilizing ever larger quantities of these ingredients. Now, I should say that the term teleconnection is one that I'm stealing from climate science, where, as far as I know, it originated. and it's used to mean, for example, the impact on the Horn of Africa of El Nino events in the Pacific. The global climate system is sufficiently interconnected that there are these teleconnections over vast distances. And that's why I'm taking that word and using it to try to illuminate the 19th century story. So that's what a teleconnection is. Here's example number one. Textile mills. So cotton production was at the heart of the early industrial revolution, as you well know. And one of the key ingredients was cotton itself, produced in many parts of the world, but the largest quantities were produced in the southern states of the United States, as this map here indicates, which occasioned a lot of deforestation and soil erosion in this part of the world. But iron also went into textile mills, a lot of machinery made out of iron that had to be mined. That was mostly done in either the British Isles or Sweden or fairly close by. And I'm not likely to emphasize that as a teleconnection. The leather belting, here's an example of it. You can see that strapping. That's where the bison leather went. That I am going to emphasize. And I should confess before I go any further that I have a weakness for what seemed to me surprising and underappreciated connections. So everybody knows that cotton from the American South went into industrialization. I will acknowledge that. But almost nobody knows that bison leather went into industrialization on a large scale. So I'm going to emphasize that. Here's a second textile example, New Zealand and wool. In the late 19th century, New Zealand became a significant wool producer. Almost all of that wool was shipped to the British Isles and the British textile mills. And the heart of it, the New Zealand wool industry, was in the so-called Canterbury Plain. That's here. And the Canterbury Plain had to be completely reconfigured to make it suitable for sheep stations, as they're called in New Zealand. So in 1800, New Zealand was still mostly forest. This is a forest map of New Zealand as of about 1200 CE, before it had any human population. It was 80% forest. It was still probably 70% forest in 1800, because the Maori, the indigenous population of New Zealand, had not deforested it very much. Most of what they'd done was in the North Island. South Island was probably at least 70% forest. But very shortly after 1840, when serious colonization began in New Zealand, the Canterbury Plain was cut and burned, seeded to grasses that sheep like, imported grasses, and turned into a landscape that looked approximately like this, sheep stations. That too occasioned a lot of deforestation and soil erosion in New Zealand. So that's probably one of the stories that I will tell in this book. Here's the third textile example, silk from Mount Lebanon. So this is Mount Lebanon here in the modern country of Lebanon. It's sort of the coastal range of mountains. And in the 19th century, villagers here went in for silk production in a very big way. And they found that they had a comparative advantage in silk production. They produced less and less in the way of olives and wheat and vegetables for their own families and villages, and more silk for export mainly to France. The first mechanical silk loom was invented in France very early in the 19th century in the city of Lyon. And by the end of the 19th century, about 93% of Lebanese silk was exported to France. But to raise silkworms and extract silk thread from the cocoons of silkworms turns out to be a fuel-intensive process. So feeding the silkworms, that required a temperature of at least 15 Celsius, which meant these rooms had to be heated in the wintertime. And then their silk cocoons had to be boiled in order to extract the thread for export. So that created intense fuel demand in Lebanon. And that was met by cutting down the forests of Mount Lebanon, the famous cedars of Lebanon. Here you can see a relict grove. There are a few of these left, but very few. This is what the magnificent tree looks like. And this is hard to make sense of this map, but it shows the reduction in forest area in Mount Lebanon. So by the early 20th century, fuel had become very scarce in Lebanon. And they began to import British coal to try to keep the silk industry afloat, so to speak. Cotton, wool, and silk will probably be the textile examples that I will use. I'm also likely to include lubricants, whale oil, which was an illuminant used in lighting, but it was also used as a machine lubricant in the 19th century, into the very early 20th century, because it's actually a really good machine lubricant, especially under high temperatures. So until chemical engineers got really ingenious, whale oil was the best machine lubricant you could get in certain kinds of applications. And palm oil, which we know as a food additive, was also used as a machine lubricant. So part of the worldwide hunt for whales in the 19th century was motivated by demand for whale oil as a machine lubricant. And a big part of the early palm oil production, most of which was in the lower Niger Valley in West Africa in the 19th century. Of course, now it's all over the place in Southeast Asia, but that's a different story, not connected to machine lubrication, connected instead to palm oil's role mainly as a food additive. At any rate, those are two important lubricants, both of which led to some ecological disruption, either on the high seas or in what's now Nigeria. Here's another example. It's pretty obscure. A few people in Argentina have heard of this story, but almost nobody else. So to make good leather in the 19th century, you had to tan the leather and dye it, make it soft and attractive. If you want to make boots or belts or purses or saddles. And it turns out that the best dye stuff available in the late 19th century came from the heartwood of a particular tree called the quebracho tree, which grows only here in the interior of South America, mainly in northern Argentina and a tiny bit in Bolivia and Paraguay. And from 1867 onward, it was used to tan and dye leather in Barcelona, in Hamburg, in New York, and elsewhere. And by the end of the 19th century, it was the main source of tanning dye used in the world. But to get this, you had to chop down the trees, kill them, extract the heartwood, chip it up, boil it, and that was the end of the quebracho forests in Argentina, which amounted to, according to my rough calculations, about 10 million hectares, or 10% of Argentina's forest cover. You can see some export data here. So that's another teleconnection. The leather production was in Europe or North America, but the dye stuff came from the interior of North America. And it required not only the maritime connections, but also railroad connections in South America, because the log, the quebracho log, has a specific density greater than 1. It doesn't float. It sinks in water. So it needed to be transported by railroad. This is my favorite example. So in Connecticut, on the Connecticut River, is a town called Essex. And part of that town used to be called Ivoryton. You can see on the map here, this is where it is, in the heart of Connecticut. And from the 1820s, Ivoryton became a big importer of African elephant ivory. And the reason for that is somebody invented some machinery that allowed the ivory to be sawn up into very fine pieces and used to make, at first, combs, and then the veneer for piano keys. Nowadays, piano keys are coated in plastic, but in the 19th century, they were coated in ivory. And African elephant ivory was easier to work than Asian elephant ivory, and it was also more lustrous, more attractive to the eye. So that's bad news for African elephants. And at the end of the 19th century, the US piano making business was booming. Every Victorian parlor in North America had to have a piano. And almost all the keyboards were made in Ivoryton, Connecticut. In fact, they were making half of the keyboards in the world by 1909. And again, this is a rough estimate on my part. The main business run by George Cheney, although there were a couple of ivory manufacturing businesses in Ivoryton, but the biggest one, run by George Cheney, accounted for about, I'm guessing, 100 to 150,000 elephants between 1870 and 1900, motivating elephant hunting binge in East Africa, which was intimately involved with the slave trade, because everybody transporting elephant ivory from the interior to the coast was an enslaved African. So one of the reasons I find this fascinating is the work of some chemists. Among my weaknesses as a historian is I really love finding out about things that are not well recorded in texts, but that we can get access to through other means. And this is an example of that. Looks like I've cut off some of the lettering here. I apologize. So what these chemists have done is track down a lot of ivory objects in museums in Europe and North America, museum objects that have dates of acquisition to them, so they know when they got into the museum. And then they analyze the carbon, nitrogen, and strontium isotopic structures of the molecules of this ivory. And then they match that up with soil maps from East Africa, which allow them to draw conclusions about where a particular ivory object came from, or to be more precise, where the soil that nourished the plants that a given elephant ate in its youth when it was building its tusks. And then they map this. You can see the location of the elephants that they've tracked. Now, what they didn't put on this map is the dates of each of these. But here's what their work shows. The retreat of the elephants, you might say, to steal a title of a book about China by Mark Elvin. A retreat of the African elephants, though. So here's the 1840 distribution. This is, it's educated guesswork. And the 1890 distribution of African elephants. And just to focus in on one component of this, this dotted strip is the part where elephant populations had already been exterminated. And then you can see the big expansion of that by 1890. And you can also see a reduction in areas where elephants were common. So African elephants were hunted for a number of reasons, not just to make piano keys in Ivoryton, Connecticut, but that was a pretty big part of the equation. And like bison in North America, elephants in East Africa are a keystone species. They help to regulate vegetation, and by doing that, indirectly regulate the animal populations of East Africa. So extracting a large proportion of the elephants from East Africa creates a cascade of changes in the ecology, the wildlife biology of East Africa. So that is another story that I intend to include, linking Connecticut and East Africa in a teleconnection. So, now I'm going to get to some of the difficulties and questions that I have. A lot of other possible ingredients I could include, not just beyond the ones that I've talked about, but beyond the ones that I showed you in the plan of the book. And colleagues in India tell me that I really should include jute and indigo, and maybe I should. There's a great story of gutta percha from Indonesia, from islands Southeast Asia. Gutta percha is used to make, or was used to make insulation for undersea telegraph cables. And it comes from one specific tree, millions of which were cut down in order to build the undersea telegraph system between 1860 and 1920. Some people tell me I should include foodstuffs and sugar. I have to say I'm reluctant to do so. Another problem I have is that you'll have noticed that the examples I gave all involve either British or North American industrialization. But should I include the industrialization of continental Europe, of Russia, of Japan in the very late 19th century? And did they have teleconnections, ingredients that came from afar? I think they did, but I haven't really begun to research that part of the story. As I said before, I'm not really sure if I should include the part 3 the contemporary history of industrialization in East and Southeast Asia. And then the organization scheme that I showed you, is that the right one, ingredient by ingredient? Historians often do things in chronological order. I'm proposing not to do that, but do it topically instead. I could also do it regionally. I need to think about that more. But at the moment, I expect to do it ingredient by ingredient. Here's a bigger question, or maybe it's not bigger, but it's harder. I'm going to end this book sometime around 1900 or 1920. And the reason I'm going to do that is because I've already written one book and co-authored another book about 20th century global environmental history. And I don't want to repeat myself. Haven't really changed my mind much at all about what I wrote in those books. So this is going to end at the very beginning of the 20th century. But I'm searching for an intellectually justifiable reason for doing what I'm going to do. And here's the best I've got. I could argue that by the early 20th century, chemical engineers were inventing so many new synthetic chemicals that the direct relationship between industrialization and the natural world of whales and bison and wool and so forth was breaking. And that World War I accelerated this process because of the interdiction of shipping on the high seas. More and more substitutes were created by chemical engineers. And that once inexpensive petroleum became available, this process accelerated yet more because many, if not most, of the synthetic chemicals that go into industrial processes are petroleum derivatives. I could argue that. Alternatively, I could argue what's almost the reverse of this and claim that by 1920 or so, the basic pattern linking the lands of industrialization and the four corners of the earth was already set. And those patterns continued, but my book is about the formation of these networks of ecological teleconnection. And so logically, the story ends around 1900 or 1920. I don't think I can argue both of these things. I could argue one, I could argue the other. And maybe there's a better argument somewhere. And of course, as long as my arguments are not mutually contradictory, as these two are, in my view, I could argue that there's several reasons why ending in 1900 or 1920 is appropriate. Okay. I got three more questions I have to address, and here are two of them. I could expand the notion of teleconnection. At the moment, I'm using it in a spatial or geographical way, but I could include another dimension, a chronological kind of ecological teleconnection, and make the link between the rapid increase in carbon dioxide emissions from fossil fuel burning in the 19th century, this upward curve here, and the chemical composition of the atmosphere in the 20th and 21st century, and the accelerating climate change of modern times. That would be a teleconnection in time as opposed to a teleconnection in space. Now, I'm tempted to do this, and of course, editors and publishing houses would be keen for me to do it because it would make it more relevant to the contemporary world. But it might complicate the notion of ecological teleconnection and make the concept less powerful because less precise. So I'm tempted to do it, but I'm not absolutely committed to doing it. Next lingering question. So every global historian in the 19th century is concerned about capitalism and colonialism. And what am I going to say about these big issues in global history? I could say nothing. I could say my story is different. I want to emphasize ecological teleconnections of industrialization and not even mention the word capitalism or the word colonialism. If I do that, my professional colleagues will hammer me for neglecting the obvious. But on the other hand, if I don't have anything new to say about colonialism or capitalism, why should I bother saying anything at all? Or should I argue that ecological teleconnections are something new to say about capitalism? Maybe about colonialism, although many of the teleconnections in my story are not within the boundaries of a single empire. So the Quebracho story linking South America with Europe and North America, unless you really expand the term empire, or colonialism, there's no colonialism in that story. But there is some intersection with colonialism in most of these stories, not all. One that I haven't said anything about, but I intend to include, involves lead production in southern Spain. There's no colonialism in that story. But there is capitalism in every one of them. So how am I going to deal with that? I don't know. I don't want it to be just a story about colonialism or capitalism. So those are the three big lingering questions. Did I get them all? Yeah, the chronological, no, two big lingering questions and one not so big. The end point, the chronological, ecological teleconnections, and what to say about capitalism and colonialism. So these are things that I'm still wrestling with, haven't figured it out, but I need to figure them out before I start writing. I'm not the kind of historian who likes to write a first draft, tear it up, and do it again. I want to know what I'm going to say in detail before I start. And sometimes I change my mind about some things, but I don't want to change my mind about anything big because then I'll waste a lot of time. So I quoted Dickens at the end. Normally you should not quote John Masefield, the poet laureate, when you don't have to, but he was my grandmother's favorite poet. And he wrote about industrialization and commerce. In fact, he might have written what was the last non-ironic poem about commerce, an ode to commerce. And I'll read you the last stanza approximately the way my grandmother would read it with the meter that she so admired. Dirty British coaster with a salt cake smokestack butting through the channel in the mad March days, with a cargo of tine coal, road rails, pig lead, firewood, ironware, and cheap tin trays. So Masefield was a much admired poet a little more than a century ago, but he was not a great economic historian. And so I've rewritten the tail end of the final stanza to make it a little bit more consistent with economic history. With a cargo of tine coal, whale oil, Spain's lead, bison hide, kiwi wool, Malay tin trays. The last one I stuck in just for the Singapore audience. It doesn't scan quite as well as the original, but it is more true to the economic history of industrial Britain. So that's the end of my story. I appreciate your patience, staying with me. And now it's, I think, time to open this for quarrels, questions, whatever is on your mind. And I'm counting on Miles to regulate this just the way a bison would regulate the North American prairie.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that wonderful and fascinating talk. For everyone who has questions, please just write them in the chat and I'll read them out to John. Chief Hong is who you spoke with at the start of the presentation. John is wondering if you're going to bring conservation into the book. So I guess, you know, the 19th century conservation movement and how that intersected with these teleconnections.
Yeah, I think I am, although I haven't figured out exactly how best to do it, because in some of these stories, the depletion of the particular ingredient did spark conservation efforts. So this was true of North American bison. It was true of East African elephants. It was true, inconsequentially, of whale populations in the 19th century. It was true of forests in southern Spain. Yeah, conservation efforts in some, but not all of these stories. So I could put that in on some scale in every story where it's relevant. And then I could use that as part of the justification for ending at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, because it's really only after about 1880 that conservation efforts appear, at least as far as I know. And so I could bring that up as part of the argument for an end of an era. So the short answer is yes. Perhaps I should have said something about that in the course of the presentation, but thanks for bringing it up.
Great, thank you, John. Our next question is from Eleanor Chu, and first of all, she says that she agrees with your suggestion to keep foodstuffs out of the book, as it would make the scope just too enormous. And then her question is, concerning your thoughts about capitalism and colonialism, would it fit to link ecological teleconnection to the interrelationship / trans-imperial relationships that were inherent in colonialism, or trans-colonial competition to export to imperial markets?
Yeah, so if I do say anything at all about colonialism, which I'm tempted to do just so my professional colleagues don't hammer me, I will need to say something about trans-colonialism, which is evident in several of these stories. Commercial cooperation among empires, but in some cases also commercial competition among, say, the British and the Dutch in the gutta percha market and manufacturing business. I haven't worked out just how these things would work, but I probably will need to deal with that. But I want to prevent it from taking over my story and ending up with yet another book about colonialism or yet another book about capitalism in the 19th century. I want to recognize these things, but try to keep them off center stage.
Excellent. Oh, thank you. If possible, if everyone could mute, there's some typing interfering a bit with John. Okay, the next question is a bit lengthy, and it's a good one. It's from Youngwook Park, one of my colleagues here at NTU, and he's asking how your grand narrative here will intersect with the development of the germ theory of disease. And Kyung-wook is pointing out many ways that it does intersect, such as the fact that the anthrax that both Pasteur and Koch developed their germ theories surrounding is a disease of wool workers, and that silkworm disease was also the first issue that led Pasteur to develop his vaccine. So as far as I know, few investigated the emergence of the 19th century germ theory of disease as a consequence of global teleconnections. Interesting.
Yeah, that's especially interesting because I never thought of it before, and I didn't know about the relevance of silk to Pasteur's work. So I got to learn about this. The only way that I had planned to integrate disease history into this, and disease history is not the same as the germ theory of disease, was with the bison, because there is an idea that the radical depopulation of the bison was connected to a cattle disease called brucellosis. And I need to assess the evidence for that. I mean, other people, including this guy, Andrew Eisenberg, who wrote the book that I talked about, have tried to assess this evidence. But I will need to reassess that evidence to make sure that I think the textile mills are the real driving force in the bison story and not brucellosis. But thank you for that question. And I've taken down a few notes about things that I need to look into. And by the way, if you've got references, citations that will save me some trouble, I'd really appreciate that.
Okay, Kyung-wook, perhaps you can send him some references. The next question is from Tim Barnard. I mentioned him before. He's an environmental historian of Singapore. He's produced quite a bit of work on the subject, and his question for you is as follows. When you discuss the ecological devastation due to teleconnections, destroying the bison herds or forests in Argentina, or even East African elephants, in many areas, devastation was part of larger transitions and fit with the development of industrialization. So he says, being an expert in Singaporean environmental history, let's take Singapore, Malaya as an example. In 1819, Singapore was 99% forested. Within 60 years, it was 93% deforested. This was due to the spread of plantation agriculture. Most of this was the cultivation of pepper gambia, the latter used as a dyeing agent. This then transitioned into rubber. While gutta percha is an interesting tale, it is limited. These forests throughout the region went through this transition, gambia and then rubber. Both were vital for industrialization at different points, and Singapore was key to this story, locally and on a global scale, ecologically, as rubber spread through the region and led to cultivation and transformation of environments. The deforestation from rubber then ultimately transitioned into deforestation from oil palm. So the key point then is kind of transitional exploitation. This is a phrase he's coining, if you will.
Yeah, so two things to say about that. First is rubber is potentially a great example of all this, although it's mostly a 20th century story. And a lot of the 19th century rubber production was wild rubber in Amazonia and Central Africa, and not plantation rubber, which is mainly after 1915, 1920. So if I include the gutta percha story, I might do that on the scale of half a chapter and another half chapter on rubber. But this concept of transition from one ingredient to the next as industrial history evolves. This is part of the story in a number of settings. So for example, with the Quebracho forests in Argentina, after that landscape was deforested, a lot of it was turned into cotton fields. I think wherever I find this, I'm gonna try to include it. It's not part of every story. There are some landscapes like the Canterbury Plain in New Zealand that are still producing wool now, just as they did in 1870. But there are others, and maybe Singapore is a great example of this, where there's a sequential evolution to the teleconnection that I will want to recognize. So
Excellent. Oh,
I
sorry.
read all about this in Tim's work.
Tim, do you want to chime in?
Okay, I'll violate the rules and speak. Yes, there is a bit of this in the sense that one of the works I've done is on botanic gardens where they did a lot of the research on I'll use the phrase taming of rubber or the creation of plantation rubber. But the whole idea was they sent it out to all these different botanic rubber, different types of latex producing trees were being investigated in Java, in Singapore, and Ceylon, and various things. And it just happened to be that here in Singapore, they had this particular species and the personnel who did the research on it. And then it spread from Singapore into Malaya and the Dutch East Indies, Vietnam, I mean, throughout the world. They were selling seeds to Africa, to the Caribbean, and it between about, admittedly 20th century, beginning about 1900, about 1910, much of the revenue for the Botanic Gardens was generated by seed sales, rubber seed sales, as they were spreading this technology or this, whatever you want to call that, throughout the world. And then they also then created pamphlets or booklets to explain how to grow it correctly. And it essentially led to massive deforestation or changes in the forest throughout the region as they would always go through new crops. They would introduce a new thing here. For example, before rubber and gambier, there was nutmeg. There was a disease that wiped nutmeg out. Then they had pepper and gambier, and that devastated everything. And they tried coffee for a bit, and then there was a coffee blight. Then they got rubber, and of course, rubber was the big money maker up until World War II or so. And then after that, we have the development of oil palm here. Right. But that really only came after even the 1960s and 70s. So if you're going to stop in the 19th century, it's a little more problematic with the Singapore timeline. But the idea is how I'm interested in how, for example, in Argentina, they use the trees for one thing, and then they make it cotton. So it's just further exploiting that particular landscape for industrialization. And I think that's a good part of the story. It's very interesting.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that. I do think I'll be able to include that in at least some settings. Mm-hmm. And whether rubber makes it in or not.
Because they tried to have gutta percha plantations. They went out and just got rid of all the wild gutta percha, if you will. They harvested it all. Then they tried to create plantations, and those never really worked. They had a few in Sumatra, and they tried a few in the Malayan Peninsula, but it just never really took hold. And then rubber just overwhelmed it all in the long run. So, yeah. But overall, excellent work, excellent. It sounds like a great work. Just got to get all the pieces together and figure out what fits together.
Well,
to move it forward.
I appreciate getting some help on this.
Okay, our next question is from Stefan Hubner, yet another environmental historian based in Singapore. He's at Yale NUS and he has really interesting research on industrial seascapes. He says, thank you for the great presentation. Did you come across or are you interested in species invasions linked to these teleconnections? For example, because the ingredients you mentioned did not fulfill their previous ecological functions anymore, maybe this created opportunities for alien species that were unintentionally introduced during the process of resource extraction. So he was also, and also he was wondering about Japan, bird feathers and pillows. So Japanese bird pirates killing extremely high numbers of Pacific seabirds, getting as far as some Hawaiian Islands when Roosevelt stopped them in 1909 through establishing a bird reservation. And Huebner also notes that some feathers went to the European fashion markets, but much was used for pillows and so forth, but not sure exactly where, perhaps Japan or elsewhere.
Yeah, so on the Japan story, I can't remember the name of the guy, but there's a Japan historian at Columbia University who's been working on Japanese gathering of raw materials, maybe ingredients of industrialization from Pacific Islands. And I've looked at some of his work. I think the bigger part of the Japanese story is going to be in Taiwan, Korea, and Manchuria. But I haven't sorted this out yet. I haven't really started reading about Japanese industrialization. Species introductions. Yeah, it's unusual when a radical reorganization of an ecosystem takes place, that it creates opportunity where opportunity had previously not existed for an introduced species. A great example of this, familiar to everybody in the American South, is the boll weevil in the cotton monocrop plantations of cotton. The boll weevil, this would be Donald Trump's nightmare. The boll weevil is a Mexican immigrant to the United States. And there are many such examples. Basically, wherever there's plantation production, there's almost always an introduced species that takes advantage of the new opportunities. Rubber in Southeast Asia, it is a bit of an exception in that the rubber blight that devastated rubber production in South America has never been established in the rubber plantations of Southeast Asia, which astonishes me that it hasn't gotten there and flourished yet. So yeah, there are going to be examples of this, and I think that while I didn't mention that at all, it is going to be part of my story because it is a form of ecological turbulence that results from these teleconnections. It's kind of analogous to the indirect effects that extracting elephants or bison from a savanna grassland has. It's not the first order effect, it's a secondary effect. You create a plantation, that has a lot of first order effects, usually deforestation, but then pest invasions usually follow. So they'll be there wherever I find them.
Excellent, thank you. The next question is from Wei-Chu Sim. He's a professor in our English department here, and here at NTU. And he says, the narrative seems to implicate comparative sociology in the sense that issues of ecological load displacement and ecological unequal exchange are raised. And someone like Alf Hornberg would say these are very difficult issues to raise because people think market price is tantamount to reciprocity, the commerce issue that you raised in the lovely poem. How can we persuade people that money price is not reciprocity? And he's listing some citations here, such as Alf Hornberg's zero-sum world challenges in conceptualizing environmental load displacement.
So Alf Hornberg's work is something that I've known about for some years now. and I even co-edited a book with him once upon a time. I find his stuff really interesting. Some of the calculations involve assumptions that I'm not sure are all that reliable, but conceptually it's really interesting. This environmental load displacement and the history of cotton is one of his favorite examples. How can we convince people that market price is not amount to value? Well, nobody has a good answer to that, at least not so far. And I don't expect to be able to provide one. Although I can perhaps, as Al Hornborg and others have done, point this out. But that's not going to advance the cause of convincing people in the 21st century.
Excellent. Thank you. Our next question is from Monami Haynes. She's a professor in our sociology program here. Why would a story of ecological teleconnections, which I take to mean anthropocentric, globalized, socio-environmental change, not be a story of colonization and capitalism? I'm not clear on why you would want to bracket them out. In other words, why not meld the human and non-human ecological stories together?
Well, I do intend to meld the human and the non-human ecological stories together. This is, as I understand it, what environmental history is and does. The answer to your question is that as I've said before, I don't want this to end up as yet another book about 19th century colonialism or yet another book about 19th century capitalism. I don't want them to take over the story. I want ecological teleconnections, which I think is a new and different concept that will help us understand the 19th century in both new and better ways. I want that to be the center of the story. I want to emphasize what is new and different rather than re-emphasize what other scholars have been emphasizing for a century or more. That's the only reason I intend to do it this way.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Stefan Hubner is just noting that if you'd like to follow up with the Pacific birds, the book that's available is Akitoshi Hiroko, Japanese Advance in the Pacific Ocean, the Albatross and the Great Bird Rush. Since I think I've reached the end for now of questions in the chat, maybe I'll ask you one or two of my own. First of all, if you do wind up including that third section, you framed part two as being partly the consequence of cheap energy, primarily coal, which was really, and you recognize this, a massive shipping advancement with coal-powered steamships. So if you continue through the present with East Asia and Southeast Asia, would you look at containerization, and would you see that as an analogous development with similar consequences for these teleconnections?
Miles, I am a sucker for the importance of containerization. I saw that in the paper that you shared with me. I wrote a little bit about it, I think, in the Great Acceleration.
Yes, yeah.
And I just wrote a lot more about it in a world history textbook that I just published. In fact, just released a few weeks ago. So in here is an interpretation of what I call the rise of the East, meaning East and Southeast Asia, mainly since 1980, in which containerization plays a huge role. And so if I put part 3 into this book, I will once again be trying to explain the industrialization of East and Southeast Asia over the last 40, 50 years, and containerization and the efficiency of shipping, linking this part of the world to distant markets is going to be a huge part of the story. I also actually think that state policy is a big part of the story of industrialization in East and Southeast Asia, but containerization is absolutely crucial. And somehow it fits my prejudice as a historian. I have a weakness for what I will call little things with big consequences. I mean, maybe containerization isn't a little thing, but next to the implications for the global economy that it had, it seems to me like acorn from which a giant oak grew. These are the kinds of stories that that I enjoy and like to tell. My answer is yes.
Okay, excellent. I've got another, okay. First, I've got a comment from Eleanor Chu. She notes that it may be of interest to you that there was a Japanese copper mine on Moresby Island in British Columbia from 1907 to 1920, and Japanese companies started the iron mining industry on the Malay Peninsula, but only from 1921, which is outside of your chronological scope. So if you do wind up going in that direction of Japanese industrialization, there are some more
Okay,
examples.
so I need to ask, how do I find out about these things?
Eleanor, do you want to just come live if you don't mind, or type it in and I can read it out?
Send me an email. That would be much appreciated.
Okay.
Particularly the British Columbia case, because it starts a little earlier, and copper might well be one of the ores that I emphasize in this story.
She says she'll be happy to send you an email. Her mic doesn't work very well.
Great.
Okay, now we have a question from Faiza Zachariah. She's another environmental historian in my program here at NTU. She does very interesting work looking at the Indonesian highlands and I guess Islamic environmental policies. She says, thank you for the amazing talk. Ecological teleconnections in this rendering seem to be production oriented. Did the consumption side matter? And if so, how? This question might have implications on the question of whether to frame this as a story of continuity or of change. The former stress patterns and continuities of infrastructural development while adopting chemical material synthesis indicates user end change. On the same issue of continuity and change, would the 1900s then represent an end in the sense of an ideological convergence worldwide towards embracing modernity facilitated by teleconnections?
Wow. That's a tough one. First, let me say that while I'm a little bit shy about dealing with capitalism and colonialism, I'm really shy about dealing with modernity. The reason for that is it means different things in different contexts and to different readers. And even if I try to define it the way I want to, readers will understand it the way they understand it. So I almost never use the word modernity. Okay, consumer or consumption versus production. You're absolutely right that the story as I'm telling it is very much focused on production and the processes of industrial production. Obviously, to some extent, that is linked to demand and consumption and changes in fashion, changes in demand for one good as opposed to another good. And there's any number of examples of that, but one that I alluded to is the demand for pianos, which is related to a cultural shift in which bourgeois households had to have a piano in their parlor. And by 1850, 1870, that's very widely true. In 1810, it was not very widely true. And that's, it's partly a story of cultural shift, but it's also a story of the cheapness of pianos and the way they get produced as a factory product as opposed to a craftsman's product, and are no longer the good of aristocratic households, but now middle-class households. So consumption and production are dovetailing in just about every instance. And my temptation is to deal with this upfront in the introduction and not go into it in each story, but try to emphasize what's happening on the ground in East Africa or in Argentina, and less so what's happening in the parlors of high consumption societies. I think I'll, as I say, bring that up at the beginning and leave it there.
Excellent. Again, I'll ask you a question since no one else has one at this moment. You were talking about the chronological teleconnections, and your example was how you might link this story to climate change. And I can see how, as you said, from a marketing standpoint, that might be beneficial. But if you're really thinking about it in terms of teleconnections, as you've presented it, and as a chronological teleconnection, isn't the chronological teleconnection actually with the distant past? The animal sources, the natural sources of fossil fuels. So it's kind of a teleconnection across millions of years in reverse. Would you agree or disagree?
Yeah, that's true. Coal is mainly a product of the Carboniferous era. I have, like many other people, brought this up in some other works of environmental history. If I do the chronological teleconnection of industrialization from the 19th into the 20th and 21st century in the form of carbon dioxide loading of the atmosphere, I'm sure there would be a sentence or two explaining that there's a deep chronological teleconnection route going back to the Carboniferous era, but that's something I would observe in passing in a sentence or two. I have a weakness for this kind of thing too, and slipping a little geological history in wherever I can, but I have nothing profound to say about that. And
Okay.
I'm on the illusion that I have something profound to say about the 19th century.
It seems you do. I've got a question that was sent to me privately by a student because I think she's a bit shy. Noor Hanisa Hassim wants to thank you for the presentation. She said it was especially fascinating for her as she is a history student who's only started taking one module in environmental history. And she said she found it eye-opening because she previously had the misguided idea that anything environmental should be left to scientists. And she's sorry if this distracts a bit from this conversation, but she wonders if you could briefly kind of speak to the merits of an environmental historical approach to the environment as opposed to the natural sciences.
So obviously these things are not mutually exclusive, and I work with data created by natural scientists all the time. And in fact, in this talk, I gave you one example of that, the work of the chemists with the museum objects. I'm not going to argue that environmental history is preferable to environmental science. I think it is complementary to environmental science. I will say that environmental scientists, many of them, are sometimes underinformed about the historical development of their subjects, and sometimes not even aware that it's possible to explore and chart the historical development of their subjects. This is true of some, it's certainly not true of many others. And I would say it's getting less and less true. I think the natural scientists, environmental scientists whom I read and with whom I speak and sometimes collaborate are getting more and more aware of the historical dimensions of their subjects. And I would even say more and more respectful of the historical dimensions of their subjects. So I'm actually mildly encouraged by the confluence, the intellectual confluence between historians and natural scientists in a number of arenas. Disease history would be another example of this.
Excellent, thank you. I know it's getting late there. If I can ask you just one more question. I actually personally love the organization around the Teleconnections. I would stick with it. I think it will be very engaging and a strong narrative. My question is, do you think it might be worth looking at including one failed teleconnection where the industrial demand was there, the industrial capacity in terms of transportation was there, and for whatever reason, nature didn't cooperate? The reason I thought about this is you're going to include a discussion of bison leather. In the book I'm working on, looking at human interactions with sharks globally, I'm starting the book with a chapter on a failed attempt, but a very grandiose attempt to establish a global shark leather industry, which took all of this technology. It created this figure, Alfred Ehrenreich, created this steamship that had a shark leather factory aboard and was meant to go around the world teaching people how to develop shark leather. He actually managed to establish shark leather factories on multiple continents. The problem is that sharks just can't withstand sustained fishing effort, and so it collapsed very rapidly. So it might be interesting to include some sort of failed ecological teleconnection, perhaps.
When did this happen?
That happened late 19th, early 20th century.
And does it look like shark populations declined significantly as a result of the attempt?
Yes, the people who participate in it note that local numbers almost immediately decline. Yeah.
Huh. This is a totally new story to me.
Yeah, it was a new story for me as well.
Okay, so I am not philosophically opposed to including a failed effort at establishing an ongoing teleconnection, particularly if the failure has as its reason that the ecological disruption itself prevented the teleconnection from enduring, which is, right, as I understand it, the story that you are offering.
Yeah.
So, yeah. In fact, if you would hurry up and get this work done, that might, just cite you and tell that story. But you've raised an idea here that what I haven't been hunting for, and that's probably why I haven't found it, is examples of failed ecological teleconnections. But insofar as they create ecological disruptions in the four corners of the earth, it seems to me that they have sort of equal merit for my purposes. And if I could find some stories, I would tell them.
Okay.
So now I have to hunt. Miles, this is terrible because now I have a lot more things to hunt for and I don't know where to look for them. It's going to slow me down.
I'll try to send some your way if I come across any.
Okay.
Okay, well, I think that's it for questions. We really kept you for the full time, and thank you so much. I really appreciate it. That was a wonderful talk. I'm sure that people are silently applauding.
Well, thanks particularly for everybody who participated in the Q&A. Yeah, here are my notes. I hope I acknowledge you properly whenever this book is finally complete. I do really appreciate the questions and the suggestions and the help with what I've called the lingering questions. So much obliged. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. Have a great night.
Okay.
Cheers,
Bye-bye,
John.
everybody.
Bye.